He is standing right at the mouth of the shaft, with a lantern gripped in his hand, and he has completely stopped moving. This isn't the look of a man resting or catching his breath. It is the kind of stillness where your body decides to freeze before your mind even realizes there is a problem. Something deep down in the dark is making a sound that shouldn't be there. It isn't the wind whistling through the timber, and it isn't water finding a fresh crack in the stone. It isn't even the slow, heavy groan of rock settling into itself the way ancient rock usually does. He stands there for so long that the lantern starts to swing in his hand, and then he simply turns around, walks back to the surface, and never sets foot underground again. 3 days after that moment, the entrance is gone, sealed away behind black powder, oak planks, and iron bolts. The question that nobody bothered to answer for 50 years is simple. What exactly did he hear down there? There is a very specific kind of silence that only the hollows of the Appalachians can produce. It isn't the open, airy quiet you find in a field or out on a lake. This silence is dense, and it has a physical weight to it that you can feel in your chest. The ridgelines press in from both sides while the canopy closes over your head, and eventually the world outside that hollow just stops existing in any way that matters. This is the world where the mine was built. It wasn't tucked into a valley with roads and shops nearby, but was hidden in a hollow where the nearest town was a half-day ride, and a telegraph office might as well have been on another continent. The Appalachians are among the oldest mountains on this earth, worn down by millions of years into something low, rounded, and permanent. They don't look jagged or dangerous the way younger mountain ranges do, but instead they look like they have already decided everything that matters. The rock sitting under those ridgelines had been forming for hundreds of millions of years before any man ever thought to put a pick to it. When the silver deposit was discovered sometime in the early 1880s, it wasn't the kind of find that brings in big money or puts a new town on the map. It was a small, private claim worked by a handful of men who followed a narrow vein of genuine silver about 200 feet into the hillside. There was enough silver to make the effort worth it, which justified the hard work, the timber shoring, and the 2 mules they used to haul material up the steep slope. The owner of the claim wasn't some dreamer or a speculator from the city. He was a local working man who had found something real and possessed the grit to get it out of the ground himself. People who knew him said he was the type to measure twice and cut once, a man who never borrowed against ore he hadn't dug yet, and never talked about the mine more than he had to. He had built the entire operation over several years, moving slow and careful the way you have to in a place where failure is the default and resources don't come back once they are gone. The men who worked for him learned that mine the way you learn any closed system, which is to say they learned it by feel, by sound, and by the way the air moved through the shaft. Miners in that era developed a kind of deep knowledge that is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't spent their life in the dark. They could tell how far they were from a wall just by the sound of their own footsteps, and they knew the difference between a safe drip of water and the one that meant the earth above them was shifting. They read the mountain the way it needed to be read to stay alive. That specific knowledge is what makes the events of the summer of 1888 so hard to just brush aside. These were not nervous men, and they certainly weren't the type to let their imaginations run wild while they were on the clock. They had been working that same shaft for years without any trouble, and they knew every single noise that place was capable of making. But during that summer, the mountain started making a sound it had never made before, and not a single man in that hollow had a name for it. The first reports started coming in from the deeper sections of the shaft, those cramped places where the ceiling dropped low and the timber shoring was still fresh and the vein ran close to the floor. Men working that section in the summer of 1888 began coming up at the end of their shifts with a strange look in their eyes, claiming something was wrong with the sound down there. It wasn't a loud noise, like a crash or a timber cracking or anything that signaled immediate danger to a seasoned miner. It was low and rhythmic, coming from a direction that didn't match any tunnel they had actually dug. The foreman's first instinct was to blame gas, because pockets of trapped air and methane can do strange things in a confined shaft by pushing through narrow gaps and creating pressure differences that produce odd tones. That was a reasonable explanation for a man in charge to offer, so he said it once and expected the matter to be closed for good. But the matter didn't close, and when the men went back down the next day, they heard it again, and the same thing happened the day after that. What made it so hard to explain away wasn't just the sound itself, but the way it seemed to move through the earth. A gas pocket stays where it is, and an underground stream follows the gradient of the rock. But these sounds appeared in different tunnels on different shifts. Sometimes the noise showed up in sections that didn't even connect to where it had been heard the day before. Two men working a lateral cut on the north side of the shaft heard it at midday, and that same evening, a different crew on the south side reported it coming from below them, even though they were working a level higher than anyone had ever drilled. The foreman stopped offering explanations after that. He told the men to keep working and said nothing more about the noises, which was a kind of answer that the men understood all too well. Then one man simply refused to go back down into the dark. He had been on the crew since nearly the beginning and was known as one of the steadier workers, not someone with a reputation for having weak nerves or making empty complaints. He came up from a shift late in the summer and sat outside the entrance for a long time without moving a muscle. When someone finally asked him what was wrong, he didn't describe a sound exactly, but instead he told them that the mountain had answered him. He had been working alone in a lower section, tapping his pick at the rock face, and whatever was down there had tapped back. It wasn't an echo or a reverberation bouncing off the walls, but something that responded to the rhythm of his work, and then changed that rhythm on its own. He never went back down into that hole. He collected the wages that were owed to him, and left the hollow within a week, leaving his tools behind. The owner heard about the man leaving, just as he heard about the refusals and the arguments among the crew, and the descriptions that none of them could make sense of. He did exactly what you would expect from a man who had built a business with his own hands in a place that punished any sign of carelessness. He decided to go down there himself. He spent the better part of an afternoon in the lower shaft, and by most accounts, he went down there entirely alone. He brought a lantern and his own tools, and stayed underground long enough that the men waiting at the surface started to get uneasy in the fading light. He finally came back up in the early evening, but he didn't say a single word about what he might have heard in the deep. He didn't offer a gas pocket explanation or tell anyone the men were just imagining things. He ate his supper that night in total silence, and the men who shared the table with him said he looked like someone who had just been told a secret he wasn't allowed to repeat. 3 days later, he started making the arrangements to close the mine forever. He didn't announce the closure to the town. There was no big meeting, no formal notice, and no explanation posted at the entrance for the workers to read. He simply began settling his accounts by paying out wages and shaking hands where hands were offered, telling the men the vein had finally given out. He said it quietly, the way you say something when you'd rather not be questioned, and most of them took the money and left without pushing back. Men in that situation understood that asking too many questions usually cost more than it returned. But 2 of the rock face workers knew exactly what they had been looking at every day for the past several months, and they knew the vein hadn't given out at all. The silver was still running, and while it wasn't wide, it was consistent enough to be the kind of ore body you work for years before it truly exhausts itself. One of the miners said as much to the owner's face, but the owner just looked at him for a long moment and said nothing to contradict him. He simply repeated that the mine was closing and that the matter was no longer open for discussion. Within a week of those final conversations, he brought in enough black powder to collapse the upper entrance of the shaft. It wasn't a rough or messy job, and it was clear that someone who knew exactly what they were doing had set those charges. The blast closed the shaft mouth perfectly without bringing down the hillside above it, making it a controlled closure rather than an act of panic. The rubble from the blast was still piled high at the entrance when he had the heavy oak planks bolted over the opening. He used 6-inch timber, cut heavy and fixed with iron hardware that wasn't coming loose without a serious effort, because he wasn't just boarding up a doorway, he was making sure no one could follow him inside. The county paperwork was filed shortly after the blast. He turned in a closure notice, which was standard procedure for an abandoned claim, and listed the official reason as the exhaustion of the mineral deposit. That document sat in the county records for decades, and anyone who went looking for it would find a clean, bureaucratic explanation for why the work had stopped. The mine was played out, There was nothing left to dig, and it was time to move on. Except the geology of the mountain didn't support that story, and at least 2 men who had worked at rock face were still alive and remembered what they had seen with their own eyes. The ore was definitely there, which meant the filing was false, or at the very least, it was deeply misleading. In a region where mineral claims were taken seriously and men didn't walk away from producing silver without a fight, people noticed that something was wrong. What people noticed even more, though, was the way the man changed after he sealed that mountain. He had always been a contained person who wasn't given to much social conversation, but there is a massive difference between being private and being completely sealed off. After the closure, he stopped mentioning the mine entirely, and he didn't just avoid the subject with strangers. He cut it off with the people who had worked for him, the very people who had a direct stake in understanding why their livelihoods had vanished. Someone would bring it up, and he would go quiet in a way that ended the conversation without a single word being exchanged. Sometimes he would shift the topic to something else so abruptly that whoever he was talking to understood they weren't going to get an answer. His neighbors eventually put the pieces together over time, the way you piece together a story that no one will say out loud. The mine had been his main enterprise for years, the thing he had built and tended and staked his entire life on, and now he didn't just walk away from it, but he acted as though he had never wanted the place at all. It was as if the silver had been nothing more than an inconvenience that led him somewhere he never should have gone. The mountain took the entrance back much faster than anyone expected. Vine and root and mountain weather worked the rubble pile until it blended into the hillside, and the planks weathered to a dull gray, and the hollow got quiet again the way it had been before the first pick ever struck that vein. For a long while, the people in the valley let it stay that way. Small communities tucked away in isolated hollows do not forget things the way people in the cities do. In a city, stories get buried under new construction and the constant noise of new people moving in. But a hollow has none of that to hide behind. The same families stay on the same land for generations, and the things that happened to their grandfathers are passed down as instructions rather than history. You learn early on that certain places are avoided for reasons no one fully explains, and you learn not to ask too many questions because the adults who know the answers look like they regret finding them out. The mine lived in the local memory for the next several decades as a fact with consequences, rather than a legend or entertainment for a campfire. It was treated the same way you treat a dangerous crossing on a river, where you do not need to understand the current to know you should not swim there. Because the stories that circulated were not consistent, they felt more like genuine oral history than a manufactured myth designed to impress. Real memory branches out and gets messy over time, and different families held different pieces of the story that did not always fit together cleanly. Some people claimed the owner found something in that rock that had no geological explanation, and they did not mean a strange mineral or an unusual formation. They meant something constructed that someone or something had put there on purpose, though they could not say more because the men who saw it firsthand were not talking. Others focused on the sounds and whether they had actually stopped after the entrance was sealed. There was a persistent account repeated across the hollow that on still nights when the insects went quiet, you could press your ear to the hillside and hear something moving through the rock. It was described as a low sound with the same rhythmic quality the miners had mentioned, and it seemed to work on a schedule of its own. Most people who heard these stories did not go out to the hillside to test them for themselves. Curiosity is a natural human trait, but so is the instinct to leave certain questions alone when the people who originally asked them came back looking the way the owner did. The detail that stays with you involves the local preacher, who served a congregation less than 2 miles from the mine site and reportedly refused to walk past the sealed entrance after the sun went down. He never mentioned the mine from his pulpit or made it a public matter, but he left behind private letters that his family kept for years. In one of those letters, he wrote about the site using language that did not match his usual careful theology, calling it a place where a presence not of God's making had settled into the stone. Children in that hollow were told to stay away from the site, and the way their parents told them mattered more than the words themselves. There were no ghost stories or warnings meant to frighten them, but instead the adults spoke about the mine the way they spoke about deep water or an unstable slope. They used a flatness in their voices that communicated something much worse than simple fear. You can reason with fear, but that flat and serious tone means someone already did the reasoning and arrived at a conclusion they did not want to describe to you. By the time the mine had been sealed for 20 years, the entrance was just a feature of the landscape, like a grave marker that you acknowledge and walk around. The owner lived 19 more years after he made the decision to seal that entrance. He died in 1907, which means he carried whatever he found in that lower shaft through 2 decades of ordinary life, filled with winters, harvests, and the small transactions of a man growing old. 19 years is a long time to carry a secret without ever putting it down. People who knew him in those later years always reached for the same word when they tried to describe how he had changed. He did not seem haunted or guilty, but he appeared burdened, like a man walking with an extra weight on one side that he had adjusted to but never stopped feeling. He functioned and remained present in the community, but he was not fully there in the way he had been before the summer of 1888. Anyone who had known him long enough could see the clear line between the version of him that existed before the mine and the version that came after. He sold the land around the mine not long after the closure, and he did not bother to negotiate the price. He took the first offer without making a counteroffer, which was incredibly unusual for anyone familiar with how land moved in that region. Property in those hollows did not change hands quickly because the people selling it had put years of hard labor into the soil and knew exactly what it was worth. He seemed to want the transaction finished more than he wanted a fair price for his investment. He put distance between himself and that hillside the fastest way he could, which meant signing the deed and walking away from the table forever. For most of those 19 years, he kept the silence he had established right after the closure, but something shifted during the last year of his life. It was not a dramatic change where he sat someone down for a formal confession, but instead the truth came out in pieces, dropped into conversations that had nothing to do with the mine. One account survived from a family member who spent time with him near the end of his life. While the specifics of their talk are gone, the record shows a single phrase he used to explain why he had closed the mine. He said the mountain had already been claimed before he ever put a pick to the rock. He did not say who had claimed it or how he knew, and he never described what he saw in that lower shaft that led him to that conclusion. He simply stated that someone or something had gotten there first, and he had the poor luck of drilling far enough into the earth to find out. He left nothing behind in writing, and if he ever kept a journal, it did not survive him. If he wrote letters that touched on the secrets of the mine, none of them ever turned up in the years following his death. The family member who recorded his final words noted that he did not seem relieved or unburdened after finally saying it out loud. He just went quieter, the way a person goes quiet after finishing a sentence they have been constructing in their head for a very long time. He died without leaving a formal explanation on the record, and the sealed entrance outlasted him by many decades. The mine sat there in the hillside, bolted shut and holding whatever it held, while 2 more sets of owners took title to the land and found reasons of their own not to open it. The first time the land changed hands was in 1907, which was the same year the original owner passed away. This new owner was an outsider who didn't grow up in the hollow, so he lacked that deep, local intuition that tells a man exactly what kind of ground he is standing on. To him, the property was just a legal description and a set of coordinates, not a collection of stories. He was aware of the sealed entrance because it showed up clearly on the deed survey as a permanent feature of the land. At that time, he would have seen the timber planks looking relatively solid, with the iron hardware still biting hard into the wood. For reasons that never made it into the public record, he chose to leave the entrance alone. It is possible he simply had his hands full with other parts of the property that were easier to turn into a profit, or perhaps a neighbor pulled him aside and said just enough to make him hesitate. About 10 years later, the land was sold again, but that second transfer is even more of a mystery. All that remains of that transaction is a name on a deed and a line in the county record books, leaving us with no idea what the new owner intended for the site. We do know that this second owner briefly toyed with the idea of reopening the mine during the mid-1920s. Silver prices were climbing high enough back then that even a small, difficult deposit looked like a potential gold mine on paper. To see if the project was feasible, he hired a professional surveyor to climb the hill and determine if the old shaft could be salvaged. The goal was to see if they could simply clear the sealed entrance and pick up where the old crew left off without the massive expense of starting a brand new operation. The surveyor made the climb, spent some time at the site, and eventually came back down with a report that recommended walking away from the whole thing. Interestingly, his report didn't mention any of the usual deal breakers like exhausted ore or a collapsing ceiling. He simply told the owner that the project wasn't worth the trouble it would cause. According to a story that made the rounds in the hollow later on, the surveyor admitted privately that the site had a certain feeling to it that he didn't care to be around. That is a heavy thing for a man of science and math to say to his employer. These surveyors were trained to live in a world of footage, grades, and yield per ton, where feelings didn't have a column on the balance sheet. But that was the word that came back from the mountain, and the owner apparently respected it enough to stop asking questions. The mine stayed dark, and the planks stayed bolted shut. When the Great Depression hit a few years later, the math of survival changed for everyone in the region. Silver became a focal point again because when cash disappears, anything you can dig out of the ground starts to look like a lifeline. There were still men living in those hills who knew the vein was sitting there untouched, having heard the stories from their fathers who worked the rock in the 1880s. On a purely financial level, the wealth sitting behind those oak planks should have been enough to tempt anyone. Yet, nobody made a move. There wasn't a single permit filed or even an informal inquiry made at the county office about reopening the shaft. The caution that had been handed down through local families for 2 generations proved to be much stronger than the desperation caused by the Depression. It shows you the sheer weight of a local legacy when people choose to stay hungry rather than disturb a specific patch of dirt. By the late 1930s, the mountain was slowly reclaiming the site as the planks turned a weathered gray and began to split along the grain. Moss crawled up from the damp soil to claim the lower edges of the wood, and the rubble piled behind the barrier settled into a dense, heavy mass. The entrance barely looked like a man-made structure anymore, appearing instead as just another irregular shadow on the hillside that a stranger would walk right past. That changed when someone who had grown up with the story, but lived just far enough away to be brave, decided the wait was over. He hadn't lived inside the hollow, but he'd absorbed enough of the legend to be curious, and he decided 50 years of silence was more than enough. He gathered his tools, climbed the ridge, and finally began the work of pulling the boards away. The mountain didn't give up the entrance without a fight. You might expect 50 years of Appalachian humidity to rot soft wood into mush, but the opposite had happened here. The timber had actually hardened over the decades, drying out from the inside and shrinking tight against the iron bolts until the whole structure was more like a barricade than a simple door. The men who went up there had to use heavy pry bars and a lot of muscle, struggling with bolts that had rusted into the threads until they were essentially one piece of metal. The moment the last board was wrenched free, they were hit by a wall of moving air. It was that cold, heavy breath that only comes from a space that has been sealed away for a lifetime, smelling of wet stone and minerals. Underneath that expected dampness, there was a sharper quality to the air that was much harder to describe. It wasn't the smell of rot or stagnant gas, but rather that heavy atmosphere you find in a room that has been vacant for a century, where the air feels thick with the history of whatever happened there. The blast from 1888 hadn't actually destroyed the mine, as the rubble had simply packed down into a slope they could climb over. Once they got a lantern past the opening, they saw that the upper shaft was still perfectly intact and the ceiling was holding firm. The original timber shoring was still standing in the darkness, having cured in the lack of oxygen until the wood felt almost like stone. It was clear that whoever set those charges in 1888 was a master of the craft, using just enough force to seal the world out without crushing the treasures inside. They stepped into the dark. The first chamber they entered looked like a photograph from 1888 that had been brought to life. Tools were still hanging on the left wall in the exact order a miner would have placed them at the end of a long shift. There were picks, wedges, and a hand drill, all waiting for owners who never came back. A tin cup sat on a narrow rock ledge, looking as if someone had just set it down for a water break a few minutes ago. There was no water damage and no signs of the earth shifting, leaving the dark stripe of the silver vein perfectly visible in the south wall. As the men pushed deeper into the lower sections, the ceiling began to dip and the air grew even more still. These were the parts of the mine where the old stories said the sounds had first started, the places where the original crew had refused to work. What they found carved into the walls in the deepest part of the shaft brought them to a dead stop. These weren't the standard marks you find in a working mine. Usually, a crew leaves behind a visual shorthand of chalked symbols to track their progress or warn each other about weak spots in the stone. What the men were looking at now were deep grooves cut directly into the rock face, with a level of force that was hard to imagine. The style didn't match any mining notation used in the region, and the way the rock had aged around the cuts suggested they were ancient. These marks hadn't been made in 1888, and they hadn't been made by the men who dug the silver. Standing there in the flickering lantern light, the men finally understood the secret the original crew had taken to their graves. This mine wasn't the first time someone had tunneled into this specific mountain. Someone else had been there a long time before the 1880s, and they had left something behind in a chamber they never intended for us to see. The entrance had been blasted shut in 1888 to keep the local people out of the mountain. But the ancient carvings on those deep walls suggested that someone else had done the exact same thing centuries earlier, only they were trying to keep something in. The Appalachian Range doesn't look ancient the way most people expect old things to look, and it lacks the jagged, violent peaks you see in younger mountains. These peaks are rounded, and the slopes are long and gradual, giving the whole landscape a deliberate, settled appearance as if the range has been here so long it stopped trying to prove itself. That feeling is actually backed up by science because the Central Appalachians are among the oldest mountain systems on the planet. Some of these formations date back nearly 500 million years, which means the rock those miners were cutting through in the 1880s had been sitting there longer than complex life had even existed on land. Human history in these mountains runs deep in its own right, with archaeological evidence placing people in the southern and central regions at least 16,000 years ago. Various cultures moved through, settled down, or moved on, and the Cherokee held large portions of this range as their home territory for centuries before they ever saw a European. The Shawnee traveled through these woods, and even earlier cultures whose names are lost to history left traces in the stone and earth that researchers are still trying to understand. The mountains absorbed every bit of that history, but they rarely give anything back unless you go in and ask for it directly. When the researchers looked at the markings in that lower shaft and said they didn't match Cherokee, Shawnee, or Iroquois traditions, that statement carried a lot more weight than people realize. They weren't just ruling out 3 random possibilities. They were ruling out the most famous and well-documented indigenous traditions in the entire region, and still coming up with nothing. What the markings did have, according to the experts, was a structural quality you only see in very old symbolic systems, from before the era of contact. It looked like a formal visual language developed by a culture working in total isolation over a long period, rather than something borrowed or traded from a neighbor. There was a consistent internal logic and repeated elements that suggested a real grammar, proving that whatever this was, it hadn't been invented quickly or by accident. One theory that actually held up under a closer look was that the mine shaft had accidentally broken into a sealed space that predated the mine by centuries. This wasn't just a natural hole in the ground, but a deliberate enclosure that someone had gone to a lot of trouble to close off. It's a strange mirror to the way the original mine owner went to such lengths to seal his own work later on. If that theory is right, then the men drilling that vein in the 1880s punched through an ancient boundary without knowing it, and whatever had been trapped on the other side finally came through. The acoustic side of this theory is the part that doesn't require you to believe in anything beyond basic physics. A sealed chamber with the right proportions, connected to the surface through narrow cracks in the rock, can generate low-frequency sounds under specific pressure conditions. You just need changes in barometric pressure or temperature differences between the inside and outside to get the air moving through those gaps at the right speed. The result is a sound that feels rhythmic and seems to shift its location as the weather changes, and it can even seem to respond to vibrations like a man tapping at a rock face. You send a rhythm in, and the physics of the cave sends a rhythm right back at you. That explains the sounds well enough, if you can accept the idea of a hidden chamber being connected to the tunnels. It explains why different sections of the mine picked up the noise on different days, and it accounts for the directionality the men described when they felt the sound was coming from a specific spot. Instead of bouncing around like a normal echo, the sound felt like it had a source. What this theory fails to explain is why the markings were spread out the way they were. A ceremonial chamber would usually keep its symbols in one specific spot, but the markings the men found in the 1930s weren't confined to a single wall. They showed up across multiple tunnels and at different depths, including areas that the original miners had dug out themselves. This means either the marked area was much larger than a single room, or people had been returning to these tunnels in stages over a very long time to add more carvings. Neither option proves the acoustic theory wrong, but both of them make the situation much bigger than a simple, sealed room and some weird air pressure. The men who reopened the mine filed a report with the county shortly after their visit, and it reads like a very dry, boring piece of paperwork. It is the kind of bureaucratic record written because the rules say so, not because the author expects anyone to actually read it. They noted the physical dimensions of the shaft, the condition of the wooden supports, and the equipment left behind by the previous crew. They even mentioned the ore vein still sitting in the south wall, using the flat, factual language of men who cared about measurements rather than feelings. But there were two things in that report that didn't quite fit the professional tone. The markings were given their own paragraph, though it was written carefully to avoid any descriptions that might make the men look ridiculous. The report called them carvings of unknown origin located in several sections of the lower shaft, and it made sure to note that they didn't look like standard mining marks. They recommended that a university with experience in archaeology should come out to evaluate the site, but that request went absolutely nowhere. No experts were ever called, no follow-up was scheduled, and the county just filed the paper away and moved on with their day. A few photographs were taken inside the shaft during those first few days, which shows the men knew they were looking at something worth documenting. The images that survived the years show the tools on their racks, a lantern hanging on a peg, and a simple tin cup. They show the ore vein in the wall, but when it comes to the markings, the camera seems to fail entirely. The photos of the carvings are consistently blurry or ruined by the flash, and the light never quite hits the shallow cuts in the rock the right way. We don't know if the equipment was bad, or if something happened to the film later, but the most important part of the physical record is the part that is impossible to see. Several men who went into the lower shaft reported hearing the sounds, and this actually made it into the county report, in that same emotionless language. The filing clerk wrote down the phrase, "unusual acoustic phenomena of unknown origin," and that was the end of the entry. There was no description of the noise, no attempt to explain it away, and no hint that the men were just imagining things. It was just a cold, bureaucratic acknowledgement that something was heard down there that didn't have a name. The man who actually filed that report refused to go back inside after the second day, though nobody ever wrote down his reasons. He finished all the paperwork from the safety of the surface and used measurements from the areas he had already seen to fill in the gaps. Whatever he heard on that second day, or whatever he saw on those walls when he got a closer look, stayed with him instead of going into the official document. By the early 1940s, the mine had changed hands again in a quiet deal that didn't mention anything about what was hidden inside. The new owner resealed the entrance, but he didn't use the same level of care as the first man, so there was no black powder or heavy iron hardware this time. He just nailed some boards across the opening to show that visitors weren't welcome, and he let the mountain take over the rest of the work. Within a few seasons, the brush had grown back over the rocks and the hollow went quiet again, just like it had been for centuries. That county report is still sitting in an archive somewhere, and those photographs probably exist in a box where the images are too faded to read. The markings are still there on the walls, sitting in a darkness that hasn't been broken since those boards were nailed up. If the acoustic theory is right, The sounds are still echoing through those tunnels as the air pressure shifts against the ancient stone. The mountain is just doing what physics requires, and it doesn't care at all if there is anyone left alive to hear it. That mine still sits inside the hillside, sealed tight in a hollow that most maps don't even bother to name. Whatever the owner heard back in the summer of 1888 was enough to make him walk away from a fortune in silver and never look back. Those markings are still carved into the walls, and the last people who ventured inside claim the sounds haven't stopped either. Some things stay buried because the people who found them realized the mountain had a better claim to the land than they did. Subscribe if you want more stories from the places that stayed quiet, and share this with someone who thinks they know what's waiting down there. He is standing right at the mouth of the shaft with a lantern gripped in his hand, and he has completely stopped moving. This isn't the look of a man resting or catching his breath. It is the kind of stillness where your body decides to freeze before your mind even realizes there is a problem.